Hello everyone, myself Prithvi, Dan and Aditi are excited to share our final project about improving Parkinson's disease prediction using k nearest neighbors with dynamic time warping. So what is PD? Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder with both motor and non-motor symptoms. PD affects more than 10 million people worldwide and approximately 60,000 Americans are diagnosed each year. The project aims to study use of temporal information stored in sequence of patient data using dynamic time warping to predict Parkinson's disease stages. So what methodology we used? We did intensive literature survey. We used the study in order to do feature selection and normalization. We implemented various algorithms such as KNN, DTW, RNN, DTW. We did tuning and cross-validation in order to get better accuracy. So let's talk about feature selection and normalization. The dataset that we used was Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, PPMI. The dataset has variety of features and consists of 90 data files. The dataset has 156 healthy patients and 439 test patients with varying stages of PD. So what were the different features we selected? We first subcategorized features as clinical markers, imaging markers, genetics, biospecimens, and OMICS. So what kind of clinical markers? We used cognitive, behavioral, anxiety, medical and family history, demographics, and so on and so forth. In imaging, we used MRI and DAT scan. For biospecimen, we used blood sample results, urine results, lab procedure results, and CSF. We computed various scores that improved accuracy. In all, we used around 119 features. We used some extra features such as list showed activity. We also used for KNN where temporal dimension was flattened max values by feature. We used min-max normalization. Some features that we used in KNN were not applicable in DTW since they were in sequential such as sex, age, race, etc. For DTW, we tried two structures of data. First, we randomly ordered events that happened in same period. This sequence was basically feature ID and value pairs. For second, we grouped them by time period and created dense vectors. Now Dan will talk about different algorithms and how we implemented them.
KNN isn't a traditional machine learning model in the sense that it needs to be trained or fitted first. With KNN, each test patient is compared with all the patients in the dataset, and the top K matches are used to label the test patient, typically using the mode label. In our case, we had two different types of sequence data. One was a flattened array of feature ID value pairs, and the other was a sequence of dense vectors. In our case, we found that the flattened array worked better, and we were able to expedite the calculation of distance using the sparse distance function you see on the left. Dynamic time warping is a technique used to match sequences of data. In the upper left, you can see binary data for two patient sequences. Using dynamic time warping, you can get a better match between these two patients than if you were to simply calculate the distance between each patient at each time step. Dynamic time warping distance is defined recursively. First, you calculate the distance between two patient tensors, and then you take the minimum dynamic time warping distance between those two patients in one of the previous cells. The graph on the right illustrates this concept. In addition to this, it also illustrates with the orange lines the maximum warping window. The maximum warping window limits the range of calculations for dynamic time warping to increase the efficiency of this calculation. A recurrent neural network is a neural network that depends not only on the input vector x, but also on previous cell state. In our case, we implemented a 2D RNN cell, which means that it could depend on more than its previous state, but also the cell state of another cell, as well as the distance measure. You can see the calculations used to do this on the left, but it simply introduces 4 weight and biases. These weights and biases are optimized using the loss function you see at the bottom, which essentially says we want to minimize the distance between people in the same stage of Parkinson's disease. So people with the same stage should have a smaller distance than people with a different stage. The performance of our standard KNN implementation was nearly impeccable. We split the data into 90% training and 10% test and ran 10 iterations for each value of k, here 1, 3, 5, 10, and 20. Essentially, it was 100% accurate in predicting for every stage of Parkinson's. KNN with dynamic time warping did not perform as well as standard KNN. The reason for this is twofold. First, we could not incorporate non-sequential data like age, sex, and race, and other demographic information which, as it turns out, is extremely important in predicting Parkinson's stage. But also, most patient sequences were extremely short, which means that the temporal data encoded was very little. However, you will note that the RNN implementation with dynamic time warping slightly outperformed the standard dynamic time warping implementation. The warping window here is essentially infinite because no patient sequences were up to 10,000 events. In conclusion, standard KNN performed the best, likely due to its incorporation of static, non-sequential data like race, age, and sex. Also of note is that the recurrent neural network dynamic time warping slightly outperformed the KNN with standard dynamic time warping. In conclusion, dynamic time warping should be used for large longitudinal data sets and in conjunction with other models that incorporate static patient features.